tell the stories of the people who are working. And tell the stories of the grocery stores who accept SNAP, who are losing out now because people, you go through these little stores and it says, oh, we accept EBT, and that funds quite a bit of revenue, especially in rural communities.
Hello, one and all, and welcome back to a new episode of The Real Impact. I'm Michelle Rathman, and I am thankful, and I mean it, that you joined us for this conversation that, as always, works to connect the dots between policy and rural quality of life. And in the context of today's show, we're talking education, workforce, and rural economies. So before I introduce you to our powerhouse lineup of guests, and I do say it is a powerhouse panel, I want to spend just a few minutes on health policy because although it's been well over a month since the passing and signing into law of the OBBBA, also known as HR 1, which included massive tax cuts for the wealthy and massive cuts to Medicaid and changes to the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, of course, new restrictions and red tape, work requirements, and much more that will negatively impact rural. There are some other health policy gymnastics going on right now. And by that, I mean work on the 2026 Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies Bill. You may not have known that, but you do now. And on July 31st, we're recording today on August 22nd, the Senate Appropriations Committee did its markup, and I've asked Alexa McKinley Abel, Director of Government Affairs at the National Rural Health Association, to give us a really quick rundown of what came out of that session, recognizing that the Senate's full debate and vote will not be taken up until after their August recess. And as of today, that date is TBD, as they say. So here's a quick overview from Alexa.
On Thursday, July 31st, the Senate Appropriations Committee held a markup of its fiscal year 2026 Labor, Health and Human Services funding bill. This bill includes Federal Office of Rural Health Policy programs, as well as other Health Resources and Services Administration programs. What this means for rural health is that many of the programs that we saw proposed to be eliminated in the president's budget are actually funded, and funded at higher levels than we've seen in the last couple of years. Some highlights out of the bill include $66.27 million for the Medicare Rural Hospital Flexibility Program, $13.5 million for the state offices of rural health. Both of those received a bump. Like I said, the Rural Residency Planning and Development Program received a bump up from $12.7 million to $14 million. The Rural Healthcare Services Outreach Programs received a $3 million increase to $103 million. And the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program would be funded at the same level it has been for the last couple of years at $145 million. Outside of the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy, other programs were funded at the same levels, including the Area Health Education Centers program at $47 million. Overall, this is a big win for rural health, as I said, because the programs that the president's budget proposed to cut were funded by the Senate, and we can see Congress really supporting the rural health safety net. That being said, we have not seen House numbers yet, and of course the House and Senate have to agree upon numbers and pass the same budget. So it remains to be seen where the House will come out in the FY26 funding bill.
My thanks to Alexa. And we're going to continue to follow this and other health policy developments. And with that, I encourage all of us, and I really do, I encourage all of us to continue bending the ears of members of Congress to let them know how imperative it is to support legislation that sufficiently, and that's an important word, that sufficiently funds the programs that Alexa mentioned. Okay, so moving on to the heart of this conversation today, the topic, as I said at the top, we're connecting the policy dots from education to workforce and from there, rural economies. This is not a light subject. At the end, I do hope that is our goal here, that you are enlightened, even if just a little, and inspired to learn more. So for this conversation, I am grateful to welcome Dr. Jeff Strohl, Research Professor and Director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and Workforce. Now, if you've been following us, you know it was just about a year ago that we were joined by Jeff, but Much has happened since then, so I'm really grateful that he was able to carve out some time. And then after a break, when we hear from our awesome new partners at the National Association of Rural Health Clinics, it is my pleasure to welcome Gbenga Ajilore, Chief Economist of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, as we shift the conversation to talk about tariffs, taxes, and the impact on rural workforce and local economies. It's a lot. So with that, I invite you to get yourself comfortable or get yourself moving with your earbuds and listen to my conversations with Jeff Strohl and Gbenga Ajilore. I am ready, and I bet you are too, so let's go. Hey, welcome back to The Real Impact. Dr. Jeff Strohl, director and co-founder of the Georgetown University Center on Education and Workforce. I mean it when I say thank you for joining us again on The Real Impact. We have a lot to talk about, and I can think of nobody better than you to have this conversation with.
I thank you. Thank you.
Okay, there is a lot going on. I say that I feel like we're just on this never-ending treadmill, but what we really want to talk about today is that you've got a great new report out that I've been waiting to talk to you about. I think it came out in June, but honestly, Jeff, it is impossible not to see a headline today about the challenges facing public schools, community colleges, university systems across the U.S., and of course, with rural feeling the impact in ways that other areas are not. And there's a number of reasons for that. So with that said, I'd like to just have you start us off from your big picture view, a few insights on how the Trump administration policies are having an impact on both education and America's workforce through a rural lens. So what can you help us start with unpacking?
Well, I mean, this is a hard question because from our perspective on some of the educational side, it's not clear that we're fully have felt the impact, but they're big. So we know that the funding cuts hitting across the rural K-12 is going to have an impact on our ability to create a pipeline of talent moving forward. And we know that employers, as much as there's initiatives to try to revitalize manufacturing and other industries, there's no reason for a manufacturing firm to move somewhere if they don't believe that the workforce is qualified at that point and that the education system is good enough to create replacement workers. So a lot of the underinvestment happening or the clawback of investment in the rural areas is going to be damning. And then secondly, I've got a big concern about the push for vouchers because you need to have enough people in an area to create a new school system that a voucher might do on some of these more private schools. In the rural areas, they're depopulating. So it's going to be more difficult to have a new type of school system evolve, even if vouchers were to be successful. And my past history in this world suggests that it's a 50-50 bet. You don't want to cross a bridge if you only have a 50-50 chance to cross it. So this is one of the big fears. And then, health issues have multiple impacts, I think, on both the education and then the workforce. So let's just step aside from health support services, which are very important, but the investments that are made in rural hospitals create jobs and help move the economy forward. So I think we're going to start losing that, as well as, again, the health of those populations. And we see then layered on top of this, on the workforce side, is with our immigration policies, we're seeing huge amounts of labor, both official and unofficial labor is being scared out of the country. And the solution, it's a very difficult solution to increase our labor force participation because workers who are out of the labor market are out for a reason, disability. We know we had the opioid crisis, and the administration isn't ponying up major investments to have education and training policies to help those students, those potential students that you want to draw back in the labor force, be work ready, because they're not going to be work ready now. So this revitalization of manufacturing, well, it's unclear that a firm's going to go to a rural area when it's going to have a much better workforce closer to a city.
All of those are such excellent points and could be each of them an episode on their own. And you and I were kind of talking offline about, this, for example, with rural health, the Rural Transformation Fund, the Rural Health Transformation Fund. And I just want to tell our listeners, if someone tells you that it's the Rural Hospital Fund, it is not. It's the Rural Transformation Fund. And a big, big part of that, Jeff, is kind of recognizing the importance of more domination of AI, for example. And, you kind of touched on it just a moment ago. I mean, that is not going to, AI is not going to replace the thousands and thousands of kinds of jobs that we need to keep our,
Yes.
to keep businesses running and our economy going. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, you raised a really great point. AI does not buy stuff. 70% of all economic activity in almost any economy, even a capitalist economy, is from consumption. So if it was the case that AI replaces all the jobs, there are not going to be people to buy stuff, and things will trail down. So that's one thing. Secondly, I do believe that there's an awful lot of hype and little evidence, smoke and no fire, when it comes to AI at this point. I do believe it's going to be disruptive, but the U.S. economy has had disruptions before, and I think that we can learn to work with it. And I think the thing that needs to be understood about AI is it's going to be, I think, impacting at a skill level, at a task level, and not necessarily in an occupation level. So if you look historically in the United States, over from like 1970 to about 2010, 2/3 of all changes, growth in educational requirements were inside of occupations as task change. So if we move towards an AI-enabled world, we need a workforce that's able to work with it, and that population is more likely going to be college educated. So as we pull back on investments in rural post-secondary education, we're going to be, again, eating the seed corn. We're not going to be setting up a workforce that's able to move with changes in the labor market, and reliance on manufacturing and agriculture are going to be a little difficult.
Okay, Jeff, let's shift a little bit, because we talk about, and I want to really get to your report about bridging the middle skills gaps. It's so important. And middle skills gap brings me to something I read this morning. And as we talk about in rural, I mean, there's a big push to grow your own, is a term that we hear so often, is to make sure that we are engaging younger people in communities at the grade school, middle school level, through high school, and then following them all the way through, hopefully community college and maybe a 4-year institution. But just today, I read a piece about a middle school in Oregon that will be closing come fall, citing the loss of the secure rural school funding, which, for those of you who do not know, is a program that is run out of the U.S. Forest Service. Congress failed to reauthorize it, and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or H.R. 1, ended some mandatory public land payments that rural communities have relied on since 1908. Diverting those funds away from local budgets to pay for tax cuts. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So at the end of the day, when we're taking a look at $207 million being taken away from secure rural schools and Community Self-Determination Act, I mean, what is that going to mean for our young people to be even prepared to qualify to go to community college, even trade schools, because there are some requirements even going through that transitional process?
Yeah, I'm greatly worried about this disinvestment in the K-12, and I keep using the eating our seed corn. We need the workforce. People talk about the future of work. Well, and when you say that, you have to be thinking about the workforce of the future. And if our K-12 system is not preparing students to move forward, and if we see stuff like disinvestment in broadband. Right. So a lot of the rural students can get to an AP or an IB course, perhaps online, if it's not being provided in their schools. So a lot of these pieces are just going to undermine that rural workforce. So back to the thing, with manufacturing, to get a manufacturer to move to a local area, you want to make sure you've got a good workforce that is technologically savvy, because the modern manufacturing facility is highly robotic, highly computerized. You need to have technical skills. And most of the modernized career and technical education programs acknowledge this and build towards having at least a post-secondary linkage. So if you're making it out of high school prepared, You're not going to make it into college prepared. And we'll do a big disservice to these students if we kind of urge them even into technical programs if they're not ready, because they get saddled with the debt, but none of the benefits, because they tend not to succeed. They tend not to graduate. So it is, it's a slow moving train wreck in that regards. And so we want, in the current administration, have this reinvestment in skilled blue collar trade school stuff. But your point's well taken. You need to have students ready for those programs, because it's no longer hammering a nail, right? The middle skills work is, become more and more complex, and you just very little of it's available to workers with just a high school degree.
Yeah. And then you take into consideration, again, we connect the dots on this podcast, $550 million in funds that connect rural Americans to the internet, for example. And so when you don't have robust community colleges, you might rely on e-learning. And I mean, I the slow moving train wreck, it paints such an image in my head. All right. I do want to move over to your report. The Bridging the Middle Skills Gap, Connecting a Diverse Workforce to Economic Opportunity through Certificates and Associate's Degrees. And I know that you guys didn't parse out rural per se. However, the populations that you do discuss can certainly be identified as more predominant, especially when you take into consideration that, rural students are enrolling in post-secondary education at a far lesser rate than, shall we say, those who might be in metropolitan areas. So talk about this report. I know it's a big one. Just give us an overview of, why you guys did it and what were some of your high level findings. It's really fascinating.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoy this work, and it's something we hope to continue with. The main underlying premise of this work is trying to think about how we can help community colleges in particular align with projected labor market demand, because often there is a disconnect between when students start school, they look at the current labor market, but when they hit when they graduate, it's a different labor market. So first piece of this is to kind of connect with projected job demand, and then take that information and help the community colleges think about what kind of programmatic delivery is going to meet that projected demand as they go out. And so the first idea here is how to think about alignment between program delivery and labor market demand. And as you can see in the report, it falls short. Now, the one thing that we're not 100% certain of is what would a natural rate of alignment be? That's a hard question to ask, because the U.S. labor market is based on a lot of churn. What we do is we educate and train students, and we toss them into the labor market and let them splash around, job churn. And we have about 12 job changes in the career. So it takes a little bit of time for a student to latch on to the right career. More information about what's there and how their program aligns, we hope will help students make better decisions and help community colleges, especially since they're the most underfunded portion of our post-secondary system, help them make different or better enrollment management choices. Now, we want to be careful. We don't want to use work like this to just slash and burn programs, because there are a lot of community college programs that are aimed at transfer and provide more of a general skill set. Of what we focused on primarily were programs where you have more of a named program to a named occupation. So there was also a set that links over. So about, I forget in the Bridging the Middle Skills Gap, all the numbers, but overall in our earlier report called The Great Misalignment, only about 50% of programs in the community colleges, and here we look at the community college delivery for entire labor market shed area, about 50%. So that's telling us that about 50% of the programs could be reallocated to meet projected labor market demand. And this is really important because we're using education as our vehicle, our chosen method to give people access to economic opportunity. And so the alignment is the first step, right? That your program has a reasonable chance of landing a job, because you can have a really good program, but if it doesn't pay attention to demand in the market, you just create unemployment for the best program in the world, right? And this is doubly important for the rural areas that are more likely to be served by a single or a lower number of institutions. So the demands upon those institutions are much more broad because they still have the community service aspect. They've got the transfer aspect, and they've got the demand to kind of satisfy local labor market demand there. So it's a tough, a daunting task, I think.
Oh my gosh.
But it's something that would be important for those institutions the people they serve.
It is so complex. And I kind of highlighted this line. It said to address the credential shortage and open up high-paying jobs. Your report says that educators, policymakers, and employers must remove the barriers that exist at multiple junctures on the pathway from school to work. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those barriers in terms that our listeners can say, this is concrete.
Yeah.
And we have an assignment, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, the barriers part of this is fairly lengthy. So I'll just try to summarize. Yes. We've got the problem of first going. You have to start to go, and we know in the rural areas fewer students are even going to go. Secondly, we've got persistence problems, right? So if you have a financial burden or you need to work as a student,
which many of them do.
Yeah,
many most, I should say.
Yeah, it's actually the modern yes. model now. That lengthens the time that you have to be in school. So a 2-year degree in the United States actually takes 3 years. A 4-year degree takes 5 to 6. So those students are getting encumbered with more and more debt, and they have more. The longer you're in school, the less likely you are to graduate. So that in itself is a big problem. Back to your K-12 preparation issue. The modern economy demands sort of this a bit of STEM education, knowing to do your math, your math and et cetera. And so if the K-12 isn't providing this, then we pass it on to the community college and say, well, let's do developmental ed. What do they do with developmental ed? They send the kids back to high school.
The students' first exposure to it.
Yeah, wow. Exactly. And they basically send them back to high school where they couldn't do well. And hopefully the movement might be towards what we call learning, contextual learning. So if I learned math as a carpenter, not in school. I failed out of college, did the carpenter, and all of a sudden I learned how to do math. Same with many of these more trade-oriented pieces. We should teach students who have suffered and not done so well in math in high school math in their career, because then they become interested, they become attached to it, and they can learn, I think, much better. So those are some obstacles. And then, of course, we have the single parent. We've got the first generation, problem, meaning that for those of you whose parents did not go to school, there's not necessarily a home community that understands the challenges that you have on studying, working, transportation, especially back to the broadband issues. And so they kind of, one of my professors called it snowballing non-optimality. One thing adds to the other, adds to the other, adds to the other. Any one of them by themselves doesn't necessarily mean you won't make it, but put them all together and it's very difficult. And the graduation rates at community colleges show that, right? And they're very low for a variety of reasons. And it's tough.
And, Jeff, I'm going to put one other condition, if you will, in here, which is now what we're seeing with respect to health policy that has onerous work requirements and the shift towards mandates for employer-based insurance. Oh my gosh, how hard is this going to get? I mean, I don't even know if you guys have even touched on that, but these are the things that I'm looking at is that, so how do you make the determination? I want to go back to school, a rural adult learner, but if I don't meet these requirements, and I mean, it seems to me that we've just added a significant amount of new barriers potentially as a result. Jeff, I want to go here because, community colleges, and I've traveled to so many different rural areas, like four-year colleges, community colleges, many of them are the best and only option for rural learners. And they are also grappling with disappearing federal grants. They are also being squeezed, if you will, by policies that want to erase diversity, equity, and inclusion guidelines. And we know that in rural communities, that population, those populations, it's not one singular, but rural is diverse, period, end of sentence. And so, so with all of that being said, how do you see, let's discuss kind of the impact of these policies with community colleges. I mean, they're not going to be exempt from these policies and the mandates that come along with them.
Yeah, that's a big one. And we know that the community colleges carry more of their educational costs than other institutions to start with. And then that's been chased down up by legislators cutting even more funding for the community college. So add the rest of this on top, it's going to be very difficult for those institutions to meet need, especially in high cost programs. So if it's the case that let's say computer manufacturing, right? You require a lot of money in the lab there to do that, but if you don't have it, you're not going to provide it. And it goes back to this downward spiral for trying to get manufacturing in to the local economy. So then another level of these funding cuts that you don't think about, it's just a sort of a ripple turning into a tidal wave. My dad, when he was alive, lived in Birmingham, Alabama, where they have a very large medical facility. So you pull away federal dollars from those grants. That's going to really lower economic activity. You pull away indirect costs, which also have a spillover effect. Then people start to leave. You're going to have I'm going to say like the Rust Belt problem, right? We're going to have this rural problem that you're going to keep pulling away foundational elements that feed into creating robust localized economies. So that if the community college is in some worlds, you have, higher level professionals at the 4-year level. Every one of those people needs support services through technicians, through people with associate's degrees, certificates, and certifications. Move one of those, you move 3 or 4 of those people out of the band, and so you don't have funding coming in to provide the services. You don't have people who can afford to go, and it's just scary. I just keep using the analogy of eating our seed corn. We cannot. Let's just say tariffs would work wonderfully and revitalize America from 7% production workers that it has today back to the 30% that it had in 1979. It ain't going to happen overnight. So the people who are going to pay the price for this are those who are dislocated. And if we don't have education and training related services and investments, we aren't going to be able to help those dislocated workers. And the community college is the place that we tend to do that because it's more able to work. It tends to historically work more with employers to try to change curriculum to meet employer needs. And so we're chopping all the legs out from under the rural stool in this scenario.
Yeah. And it makes me think, before I talk to you about policy, it makes me think about even what this might be doing to our rural educators workforce. When you know that you are working at a deficit, when you know that the resources will not be there, you could potentially lose your motivation to even want to enter in, because I know that in nursing, for example, we need nurse educators, right?
Yeah.
We need educators who are teaching those courses and so forth. So I'm sure there are implications there as well. Are you seeing anything?
I'm not seeing anything, but I'm concerned, going back to the voucher discussion, is, teacher education is extremely important. It builds, helps build our citizenry up. And so if people in the rural area don't want to work there and they're not being supported, and then all of a sudden you get rid of the school structure, what kind of incentives are voucher-driven, newly private, innovative schools going to be able to create, especially at their small scale? Yeah. Right. And so one of the things that is lost with some of the charter schools and some of the voucher programs is teacher security. Right. So would you come into a position where you're on a 1-year contract? I mean, you're going to move to rural wherever, if you only have a 1-year contract, you have no guarantee of security. I mean, there are efforts, where they give bonuses, et cetera, trying to revitalize, but that's going to be undercut by this movement to rethink public education through the kind of these voucher efforts. How much pickup there is in that, I don't know. but work that's been done on vouchers is they suck more dollars from the public schooling system than they deliver in education in the voucher side of the house. So,
and we have yet to really understand the quality of said education, and that is the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and how our students, what their outcomes are. Okay, that's another whole conversation. Before I let you go, Jeff, the part 3 of this great paper, which to our listeners, we're going to make sure the links are on our website for you to go ahead and go to Georgetown's website to download this. But you talk about policy and practice recommendations. Can you give us a couple of doozies that our listeners can take away? Because, we all are responsible for advocating for this policy as well. It just can't just be employers or these higher education institutions. We all play a part in this because we are going in this future together, whether we want to or not. So what are some of the policy and practice recommendations that come to mind?
Well, the ones that are most important to me is, one, I think we really need to up our investments in career and college navigation. In the world that we're in today, there's so much data there. I couldn't make it through it myself. My son, who just went to college with somebody who does data, just did what his cohort did. We need better guidance for these students to make it forward. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think it's extremely important that we have employer engagement in part of this process. The employers have pulled back from their commitment in the American workforce. They don't train as much as they used to. We moved from a layoff model to a fire model in about 1992-93. It turns it so that the workforce in some sense is being created as a spot market. The employers, when they talk about I can't find workers, they mean I can't find workers today, rather than a worker they can even train up. Wow. And so we really need to get this engagement, because the data, in our report is kind of a higher level. We need the employer to get engaged and say, we're falling short here on these particular programs, and invest so that the students have higher likelihood of becoming employed. What kind of engagement can we get, especially in these rural areas, right? And these, I've worked with a lot of those firms, and they are really engaged. I just need to up their game, and so does the state. The states have to help here, which is we want to tighten that engagement, sometimes by bringing the workplace and the classroom closer together, so that the employer knows, some risk sharing agreements, so that the employer knows when they're taking a risk on a student from one of these schools, that they have a high likelihood of quickness to productivity, staying with the firm, things like that. And so those are the two biggies for me.
Yeah, especially since we know pipelines, when they're dry, man, they are dry. And that's a good way to put it. What I've been thinking about so much. I mean, it's not about having a bench. It is about having a robust pipeline, and that's shrinking. I mean, and that's happening for so many reasons. Oh my gosh, Jeff, anytime you have new wisdom, new reports, new data for us, we welcome you to come back. I want to tell our listeners it was a year ago that we had Jeff on. So thank you so much. And for the rest of you, do not go anywhere. We're going to bid farewell to Jeff, but I'm asking you to stick around, because this dot connecting conversation is not over. And we're going to shift over to the impact of these policies on rural economies, because they are connected, right after this important event announcement from our partners at the National Association of Rural Health Clinics. Sit tight. We'll be right back. The National Association of Rural Health Clinics invites you to rendezvous in Reno. Beginning October 20th, the 2.5-day NARC Fall Institute features a powerful in-person agenda, plus 3 pre-conference webinars the week before. It's your chance to engage deeply with the pressing issues facing rural health clinics today. With unmatched networking and a throwback 90s bash, you'll leave energized and reconnected. Registration closes the evening of October 19th. So don't wait. Head to narhc.org to register. That's narhc.org. Hey, we are back, and now it is truly my distinct pleasure to welcome Gbenga Ajilore, Chief Economist of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been too long, but I am an avid follower of yours on LinkedIn, wherever I can find you. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to be here.
Oh my gosh. Well, listen, as I've been saying, there is a lot to talk about. I don't think we can have enough of these conversations, enlightening, connecting policy to quality of life conversations. But Gbenga, I mentioned to you that we kicked off the episode with my conversation with Dr. Jeff Strohl from Georgetown University Center on Education and Workforce. And we had kind of a wide-ranging discussion focused on the impact of the Trump administration's policies with respect to education, K through 12, community college, as well as a paper that they put out, the need to address the growing gaps, and they are growing, and barriers related to middle skills development. And, a significant of that portion of that conversation centered on eliminating funding for education, which will, of course, disproportionately affect rural areas. It can't help but not, because that's the trend that we see. And we know that by, that ripple effect, and because nothing happens in a bubble where that's concerned, the lack of investments in education, in my view, will then affect job training, which is going to impact our workforce. It's kind of a cascading. He described it as a tsunami inside of a hurricane or something like that. So what I really want to start with you is that in June, you wrote a really compelling piece, and we're going to make sure that links to your information is on our website. And it was titled House Republican Reconciliation Bill Would Harm Rural Households, Communities, and Economies. Well, we have shifted from would to will. And so I want to talk about those impacts. What are they on rural households, communities, and economies? Just give us a big picture and lay it on us. Don't spare us. We need to hear it all.
Yeah. So thank you for having me, and appreciate the kind words about my piece. What we're talking about is, when you look at the bill, it's basically cutting taxes for the rich and then cutting spending on low income and moderate income households. And that's done basically through cuts in health coverage and cuts in food assistance. And so we're looking at, the largest cuts to programs like Medicaid and SNAP that we've seen in history.
Right.
And these were, really well-funded programs to begin with. And so the way this is happening is by making people ineligible for these programs. And so, like with Medicaid, what they're doing is they're adding work requirements. And these are not really work requirements, because people work. A lot of people who are on Medicaid work multiple jobs. What they're doing is making people report their work requirements. And so that adds an additional layer of bureaucracy, of red tape. And so when it becomes difficult to report, then you get kicked off. And so one sort of example here is they have a 70-hour work requirement, monthly work requirement, which on the face of it seems benign. But if you think about the people, especially at low income households, the jobs that they don't have control over their hours. So 1 month they may be working 80 hours and able to meet these reporting requirements, but the next month it might be 60 hours and then they get kicked off. And then the next month it might be like 65 hours. And so that's the kind of thing. And that's where they get these quote unquote savings in these cuts. With SNAP, they have work requirements. But the other thing is, and this is where it actually really hits rural communities, is that a couple of years ago, there was a Fiscal Responsibility Act where they added work requirements on SNAP, but they exempted a bunch of different groups, veterans, homeless populations, and then people outside the ages of 18 to 54. Well, what this bill did is that it went from 18 to 54 up to 64.
Yes.
And we know that rural America is a little bit more aged. And so now you have these people who weren't subject to these requirements. Now they're subject to these requirements, and they're going to be, and then these people are going to get kicked off. The other thing that's really tough is with SNAP, they're putting some of the onus on the states to pay for it. And we know that states don't have the ability, like the federal government, to run deficits and debt. They have to have a balanced budget. So now you're adding more costs to the states, and they have to make a decision about how do we make up that shortfall. And so some states are not going to make up that shortfall, and they're just going to do it by kicking people off. And so I can keep going, but that's just basically what is happening with the mega bill in terms of making it harder for low and moderate income households.
And on top of that, and I'm going to put this, I want to mention this morning, the day we're recording this is August 22nd, and I just listened to Julie Rovner's What the Health podcast, and I mentioned this because it is the anniversary of Medicare and Medicaid. And it's not just the work requirements, it's the fact that the systems, the infrastructure is not there. And is my understanding that attestations are not going to be accepted, that there's just the paperwork. And as I understand, the squeeze is really going to come with enrollment. And that's, how they're going to achieve some of the savings. And so, we know the impact is going to be devastating, but it's the layers of complication, I think, were done quite intentionally. That's my opinion. Okay. I do want to dive into tariffs, and I never thought I would say that on a Friday. But first, I do wonder if you can talk a few moments, because I know it's all connected. You also did a recording, kind of a video blog, if you will, about your thoughts around the July jobs report, including the rural impact. If you could kind of parse that out for me, and perhaps touch on the topic of U.S. immigrant workforce, which it does account, my understanding, about 5% of the rural workforce nationwide. These have to be connected, right?
Yeah. So on the July jobs report, it came in really under what there were expectations. And there was there's a lot of stuff about revisions, and there was stuff about the Bureau of Labor Statistics that we won't go into. Mm-hmm. But one of the things is that it showed is that there's softening in the labor market, that the jobs are not there. And a lot of it is because of, as you mentioned, tariffs. Tariffs basically are a tax on imports. And so kind of want to give a broad overview of tariffs.
Yes.
The average tariff rate at the beginning of this year, January 2025, was 2.4%. Right now, given all the stuff that's happened, it's 18.6%. We're looking at a 9-fold tax increase on goods that everyone spends. And the tariffs are, steel, aluminum, fertilizer. So we think about the agricultural sector. They're spending more on tractors, on fencing, grain bins, fertilizer. This is hitting, this farmers harder. As you mentioned, then there's immigration. So now you put that on top of it. So you have these higher costs. You're losing your workforce. I just read a story in Florida where, there was a farmer who lost like 50% of their workforce. Once some were deported, but then even the migrants, they didn't just show up for work. And you need people to, have the farm. And so if you can't do that, you're going to be losing out. So that's also going to increase prices. So you have all these competing factors that are just kind of going on top of each other. That's harming the labor market, but then also grocery prices at the stores. We're in back to school season right now. We're seeing prices of things like that going up, little things like index cards, binders, folders. And so we're having all these factors that are just hitting everyone hard. And, when we hit the economy hard, we know that hits rural America much harder.
It seems to me that there's a whole lot of attempts to distract from the core of what you're talking about. And then I think about what it's going to do to, in rural specifically, like the county budgets, like how are rural economies, if you just look at it from a, community by community level. I mean, I just cannot imagine that there's going to be, any silver lining anytime soon.
No, you bring up a great point about budgets where, again, they have to balance their budget. And so you have like a number of states who've been cutting income taxes. There's talks about cutting property taxes. This is funding the revenue for these local governments. Mm-hmm. And so when you're taking away revenue, you're increasing the burden in terms of costs, like on SNAP, on Medicaid, things like that. It's like, how do you adjust? And even then, I keep talking about all these things that are laying on top of it. Recently, the Department of Agriculture is doing a reorganization. We have that we've lost lots of federal workers.
Oh my gosh.
And everyone talks about it in terms of what's happening in DC and the workers there. But think about the Department of Agriculture. Think about all these, they have a lot of regional offices, a lot of field offices. I think the USDA has lost 15,000 workers. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these have been in the state offices, the field offices, the places that are really close to these rural communities. And so now you have this added impact in terms of the county budgets, but then the workers who help service these communities are gone now. And so now you've lost out there. So it's all these compounding effects. And it's just one of those things where people, once they start to feel it, it's almost too late.
Yeah, because we take it for granted. People, for the most part, I mean, I would go kind of do on the street interviews and say, hey, what do you think happens at a USDA field office? And there'd be crickets because people don't understand it until it's gone. And that includes, I was reading a piece about all the inspectors that are not there any longer, food inspectors and so forth. And so certainly, I mean, it is like coming to a pillow fight with your pillowcase loaded with bricks. And that is what you're using right now. Okay. So there's been some talk about, well, there's, we're going to get some tax cuts or maybe tax credits. So let's talk about tax cuts and the reality of what this means for the average, if there is such a thing, rural household. I mean, how will rural households benefit from massive tax cuts? I know the answer.
So
I think.
The answer is they won't, unless you're in the top 10% or top 1%. Then there's going to be a benefit because whenever you cut taxes, it's always skewed towards the wealthy. So just some basic numbers, top 10%, they'll have a benefit of about nearly $8,000 from this tax cut. And then everyone below that is going to lose. So if you factor in what's happening with tariffs, everyone else is going to lose. The bottom 10%, they're going to lose about $3,000. Now, some people will say, well, there's these different provisions that are helping people out, like the child tax credit. They expanded from 2,000 to 2,200, except it's not refundable. And because it's not refundable, if you don't make enough money, you don't see that extra benefit. And so it's one thing. And the thing is, they could have made it refundable, which then that's going to benefit middle, lower income households, but they didn't. So that extra, it doesn't go to that. The other one, the estate tax. You have the estate tax. They had this exemption, which was 15 million before. They expanded to 30 million. And that means, so the estate tax is what you could pass on to your kids. And the justification is that, oh, this is going to help our family farms. But as we all know, family farms aren't paying that. And in fact, there's something about, I think like 1,000 wealthy estates are the ones who actually are subject to the tax. But now that they've increased that exemption, they're looking at an average of almost $5.7 million benefits, that 1,000 estates. And so even if you break it down to the smaller provisions, it still doesn't benefit low and middle income households and rural households.
Yeah, none of this does. I mean, the provisions that cut Medicaid, that everything that you've talked about. Okay, so I've been hearing a lot, and too much to my chagrin, and I understand it. I do, because we have to be able to just put one foot in front of the other every single day. But I've been hearing a lot of experts and consultants talk about how important it is for us to adapt to the conditions created by these policies, which would be, I can adapt to weather. We all find ourselves adaptable in different situations. But what are your thoughts about adapting? I mean, how do we really adapt to already underfunded rural programs, now cascading negative impacts of cuts and rising costs? I mean, what is another action we can take in your view, other than just adapting?
I struggle with that framing of adapting because we've asked particularly rural communities to adapt to a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have to. And at some point you have to say, no, shouldn't adapt. We should actually focus them. They should be the focus of our policy. It shouldn't be like the after effects. So like what I think about is advocacy. How do you advocate? How do you tell the story? And so the thing is looking at how are people impacted. So when you say, well, the Medicaid cuts aren't going to hurt, or people should be working if they're going to take SNAP. Tell the stories of the people who are working. And tell the stories of the grocery stores who accept SNAP, who are losing out now because people, you go through these little stores and it says, oh, we accept EBT, and that funds quite a bit of revenue, especially in rural communities. And so now you tell the story. It's like, well, these people are not shopping anymore because they don't have the funds from SNAP that helped us do that. Our hospital, we used to have an OB practice, but now because we have less people insured, now we have to give that up because it's too costly. And now that person, instead of going to that hospital, is like 20, 30 minutes away, it's 2 hours away.
Yes.
Right. And so, but telling those stories, getting that stories out there to see that this is actually really costly. And, you could talk about 20 million people are going to lose insurance or how much these big numbers, but the individual story, the people, you think about the communities. Just the other day, they're talking about the solar and wind panels that they're going to do restrictions on that. And I was reading a story about this grocery store in Pinesville, Kentucky, that, was able to compete with the larger grocery stores. They've been there for 60 years because they put a solar array in it. And now they're able to have lower costs. And so like that grocery store was very important, and telling that story can inform why these things matter. So finding these stories, telling these stories, getting it out there and why it matters and why it helps create these vibrant, strong communities, rural communities.
That's a great example. Last year I was in rural Oregon, and USDA Rural Development was responsible for funding a solar operation on the roof of a brewery, of a local brewery. And it created hundreds of jobs, temporary and then permanent jobs after the fact. And so I love what you said about telling your stories. And I think one of the things that's so important is not just telling the stories and pushing them out. And maybe you'll agree with me, is that like, this is where the rubber meets the road. I tell people we're not resting, so our representatives can't rest either. Bring them to your communities. And we had a conversation last week about the fact that sometimes politicians don't feel the need to visit communities anymore. We've gotten
Right.
to that place. And so telling the stories and having people come see it firsthand and hear those stories, because I wonder if that might get us a little bit more traction than just simply trying to send out an email or show up at someone's door. But anyway, oh my gosh, Gbenga, listen, I really mean this. Anything that you got for us that connects the dots between these policies and the economics of it and rural, we welcome you back anytime you are most informative. And I do encourage people to follow you. Tell us where they can find you.
So they can find us, find me at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities website. And then I also am on Twitter, Blue Sky, and TikTok. I've started to do a lot of TikTok videos and then some rural focused TikTok videos too.
Well, you are braver than I, because I have not gone there yet. And I might not anymore. But anyway, thank you so much, Gbenga. And for the rest of you, do not go anywhere. We'll be right back with some closing words. As always, my thanks to Jeff and Gbenga and Alexa for their insights. And as a reminder, look to the resource page on our website, theruralimpact.com, really easy to find us. And you'll find links to the reports and blogs referenced in this episode. And while you're there, just take 2 seconds, just 2 seconds to subscribe so that you'll receive our e-blogs with recaps, details about upcoming episodes, including news about a few new in-depth series that we've got in the works for you. Also, another thanks to our partners at the National Association of Rural Health Clinics, and a reminder that if you are interested in growing your rural reach out to us to explore how the Rural Impact can help you do that, including bringing the podcast to your event or gathering. We love taking the show on the road. Be sure to follow us and me if you are so inclined on social. We're on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Facebook, and YouTube. And please be sure to leave comments and rate us. We do really appreciate when you do that. My thanks to Bria Corsaro and Sarah Staub for all their great work behind the scenes. And until the next time, I'm going to say it again. I invite you to take really good care of yourself and, to the best of your ability, all those around you. We will see you soon on a new episode of The Rural Impact.